Welcome to our continuing lecture in the contemporary world. For this lecture, we will wrap up concepts related to economic globalization, discuss the major actors of economic globalization, and some insights on the current events. Again, for our common understanding, we define globalization using Manfred Steger's definition. He says globalization refers to the expansion and intensification of social relations and consciousness across world time and world space. It is a multidimensional phenomenon involving economics, politics, culture, ideas, environment, and the technology. The modern era of free trade, which we have come to know today, started in 1944 when all the great minds of economics gathered together in a little place called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. This was known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. Although 750 delegates from 44 allied nations have suffered from World War One aftermath, the effects that was between 1914 and 1918. They also experienced the Great Depression in 1930, where the US stock market crashed, affecting other countries. And of course, World War II at this time was still raging in the Atlantic. At the top of everyone's mind, there is actually a need how to create an economy that fosters and necessitates world peace. Yes, guys, world peace seems to be the only way to have the economy moving. And seeing the idea of economic interdependence is an answer to prevent wars from erupting further. For example, if a nation is dependent on another nation for its supply chains, then they could not go to war with each other. Let me give you an example. If Germany needed France for its coal and France needed Germany to supply them with steel, then why would they go to war with each other, right? So the economic aspect was really related to political turmoil at the time. Bretton Woods was the answer. It also created the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and of course the World Bank. I suggest you read IMF and the role of World Bank. This summit, the Bretton Woods, almost led to the third organization called the International Trade Organization, or ITO, but ITO did not succeed. 4 years later, this idea became the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which created the concept of globalization, outsourcing, multinational corporations, among others. General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, or GATT, had three main provisions, of course, with some exceptions, but its main purpose was to make international trade easier. Among its provisions included that all member countries must be treated equally when it comes to tariffs, meaning GATT made trade possible among countries without discrimination. You might remember tariff is a tax or duty to be paid on a particular class of imports or exports. Secondly, GATT prohibited restrictions on the number of imports and exports. Developed countries agreed to eliminate tariff on imports from developing countries to boost those economies. Lower tariffs had benefits for developed countries as well. Note also that the Philippines was also the signatory of GATT in 1979. But of course, nothing is perfect in this world. GATT became or soon faded when it included requirements that led countries to give up some level of autonomy. One example is that United States was not able to convince Japan or China within the framework of GATT, and they were not convinced to open their markets to the US goods. In simple terms, participating countries feel that the agreement has risked the independence of nation or its democracy in decision making. Also, GATT failed to cover trade in services and intellectual property rights. And the absence of an international mechanism to resolve disputes or conflicts in the international trade among nations. GATT has held many successful rounds on different areas of economic interests. because they felt that instead of world peace and interdependence, they were motivated to look into global efficiency, meaning they were looking for ways to boost the global economy. Remember that even with GATT trade agreements, tariffs are really high, leading up to a protectionist policy, meaning countries still impose trade barriers. The idea of GATT was to lower the tariff or import or export taxes so that global economy can gain momentum. So, what does this mean? With non-tariff barrier, it lets imported products compete with local products. For example, you will see on the shelf in a department store spam luncheon meat made in the US and holiday luncheon meat made from Cebu. Of course, luncheon meat from Cebu is cheaper, but spam is really delicious and is preferred by some consumers who like imported products. The idea is to provide everyone a choice, because if you only see holiday luncheon meat, then there is a possibility that the manufacturers will raise the price to a much higher because there is no competition. So there goes the desire of the proponents of GATT to make trading smooth as possible. It underwent several rounds of tariff negotiations among nations between 1947 and 1994 until it reached the eighth round in the Uruguay Convention. The country Uruguay was the venue of these negotiations. It is the most important round because it led to the establishment of now we call the WTO, or the World Trade Organization, in January 1995. The World Trade Organization now covers agreements not included in GATT before. It has abolished restrictions in imports and also included trade in services and intellectual property rights, or IPR, and produced new mechanisms related to settling commercial disputes or conflicts. When we talk about trade and services, we talk about communications, finance, education, tourism, and environmental services. Let me give you an example. If you're using Facebook, Netflix, or Spotify today at the lowest subscription price or subscription fee, thank the free trade for that. But remember, we can impose restrictions on them too on a domestic level. Early in May last year, Congressman Joey Salceda said he filed a House Bill number 6765, which seeks to impose value-added tax for digital services such as those offered by Facebook, Google, Netflix, and Spotify, as well as for digital retailers like those on the Lazada and Shopee platforms. Our VAT, or value-added tax on imports, is at 12%. So if we impose VAT on these services, it would help us, or it will give us an earning of 29.1 billion pesos annually. That would help the country recover from the impact of the COVID pandemic. But that bill has not moved until now. The trade liberalization also allowed the importation of products. The latest being the pork imports our president has allowed on February 5, as reported by the Manila Times. Philippines is getting imported pork from the US, Canada, Spain, the United Kingdom, and Netherlands, and even Brazil to support our need for pork. This was a recommendation from the Department of Agriculture. By the way, we are the seventh biggest pork importer in the world. If you remember, our country was struck by the African swine fever outbreak in September 2009, killing live hogs or pigs in the country. Now, we are trying to balance a situation when imported products, say as cheap as about 150 peso per kilo for liempo from Spain, is competing the Manila price, which is about 450 per kilo. This was just last week. Of course, this will kill our local hog raisers. Importation amidst the pandemic would mean more local jobs would be lost, and it will allow us to be full reliant on other countries in terms of our food security. Personally, I don't mean to blame globalization on this. But our country needs to look at plans already that will help our food security and sufficiency. Otherwise, those who are benefiting from this are the importers in the Philippines. Um, into 2020, if I'm not mistaken, we had uh, around 2 million metric tons of rice being imported. So it would somehow create a tension in both farming and the hog raising industries. Now, going back to WTO, or World Trade Organization, its website says there are currently 159 countries who are members. It used to be 164. Countries belonging to this organization have benefited from trade liberalization and the movement of international capital. Although there are downsides, like countries believe that WTO created rules that only favor the developed countries, that such as patent medicine like HIV drugs. You have to wait for the patents to expire before producing your own HIV drug for cheaper or generic version. And guys, this provision is quite timely because many countries have called to waive or suspend the intellectual property protections for vaccines for COVID so that they can be produced at a certain speed by other countries or developing countries. This was a call to reform among WTO members until widespread vaccination is already in place globally. And of course, when they are vaccinated, we are vaccinated, majority of the world's population will develop immunity. There has been a good development on this, however, with our country's participation in COVID-19 vaccines global access, or COVAX, facility for vaccine distribution. Um, on February 6th, the Philippines News Agency reported that our country will receive 10 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine from the COVAX facility, most of which are manufactured by AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca. UK, or Britain, has funded £548 million in COVAX to help 92 developing countries, including the Philippines, to get COVID vaccines. So to end, Haley Edwards, on her book The Tribunals That Rule Global Trade, noted that global trade was not about trade or jobs, but it is about relations and rules. The rules have shaped global economies since the Bretton Woods, and Bretton Woods system was remade in 1995 with the World Trade Organization. The rules that we passed and serve are the rules of the trade that we live in now. Do we just want global efficiency, or do we want global prosperity for normal people like the farmers, the hog raisers, or those who are economically disadvantaged to partake in the benefit of a globalized economy? So it's very important to look globalization in a different perspective, not just on a one-sided um, perspective, because we see that has there have been um, problems and results that have affected many of us lately, brought about by this pandemic. And in fact, there are also advantages that we have gained because of our international diplomacy with other countries, brought about by globalization as well. So this is for this week. We will have more lectures in the coming sessions. For now, there will be no exams, but I suggest you comment on Facebook the codes that I am sending here so that I would know that you are listening to our lecture. If you have questions, please feel free to react on Facebook so that we can also discuss this in the future lectures we have. So, guys, stay home and stay safe, and God bless.